Shalom. Delighted to be with you back in the campus of the Yeshiva here, Alex Israel, who lives here in Alon Shvut. And we're going to start learning a little bit about Sefer Devarim. And the big question when we get to Sefer Devarim, we all know that it is called Mishneh Torah. Mishneh Torah is the rabbinic name Deuteronomy, right? The second law. And is it just a review? Is it just a review of the law or not? That is the classic question that we always ask. And of course it is not just simply a review. It's not a review because, for example, there's no Yetziat Mitzrayim, there's no Mishkan. Think about how much space is devoted to korbanot in the Torah. And here in Sefer Devarim, we don't have all of that. We don't have any Mishkan. And our stories here in Sefer Devarim are different. So many of our teachers, Rav Sabato or Rav Breuer or Rav Bazak, have, done with such an expert hand the differences between stories which are repeated, like the Aseret HaDibrot, and the differences between the two accounts, or the Meraglim, or Arei Miklat, or any other story which is repeated. It's not quite repeated, it is repeated with nuances. And so this is the question: in what way is this Mishneh Torah? In what way is this something different? It's fascinating that there is a discussion based on the phrase Be'er Heitev. We have Eila Hadvarim Asher Diber Moshe Kol Israel. These are the words that Moshe spoke to all of Israel. Be'eva hayardein, bamidbar, ba'arava, mul suf, ben parano, ben tofel, v'lavan, v'chatzirot, v'dizahav. All these multiplicity of places, we'll talk about them in a minute. And then we've got Be'eva hayardein, be'eretz Moav, ho'il Moshe, be'eret Torah hazot. What does it mean? Moshe began explaining the Torah. Let me give two interpretations. The first is the Sifrei. And the Sifrei says, Moshe said, Kvar ani samuch lemita, I know that I'm going to die shortly. Mi sheshama pasuk echad u'shechacho. If you heard a pasuk and you forgot it, yavo v'yishanenu. Mi sheshama parsha achat u'shchacha, yavo v'yishanena v'yishme'ena. L'chein ne'emar be'er heitev. According to this, what is the concept behind Mishneh Torah? It is the notion of accuracy. It is the notion that we need to review things, that we need to go over things and make sure that we have them pedantically, accurately, and that we have the authentic, accurate, identical Torah, the Masorah, that we are in the tradition, and that even if Moshe leaves us, we will have the authentic, same tradition as was given at Har Sinai. Moshe kibel Torah mi Sinai, u'masra li Yoshua, etc., etc. So this is then all about getting things right. Ho'il Moshe be'er et ha-Torah hazot. However, there is a different interpretation which was given by our teacher, Rav Amital. And Rav Amital brought the famous Rashi, which says there was be'er heitev in 70 languages. And he said, really? 70 languages? Was there anybody in the camp of Israel who needed it translated into Portuguese or into Russian? Were there people who needed it in British English or American English? What's this idea of translating into multiple languages? And then something else, which is, why do we need all these places? How are they relevant? Etc., etc. And why do we need the time? A particular time, a particular place, and a particular language. Says Rav Amital, right? So Rav Amital, we just had his yahrzeit last week, that the Torah needs to be applicable. It's going to need to be applicable in specific circumstances. This is not about having one pristine Torah where one size fits all. But rather, this is about the application of Torah. This is about the relevance of Torah. This is about the ideas that actually need to be embodied in a specific time, in a specific place, in a specific way. And that will depend on where you are, that will depend on when you are, that will depend on the culture that you find yourself in, the language that you're speaking. That's what it means, be'er heitev. there is one Torah, but the idea that the Torah splits into 70 different Shivim Panim LeTorah is what is already being instituted through this Be'er Hetev, or maybe put it slightly differently. The question isn't going to be one of accuracy, but it's going to be one of application. Or maybe I'll put it slightly differently. Whenever we tell a story, even telling the story itself is already the beginning of an interpretation. And postmodernism has done quite an interesting job on this, about the notion of different stories being told as narratives rather than one single truth. Or maybe, as Dr. Micha Goodman puts it, Sefer Devarim is the first midrash. It's already, in a sense, a midrash on the other Sfarim of the Torah. And that's sort of what I want to try and do with two examples today in our time together. So let's start the Parsha, and we start reading through where we are at Har Sinai. Hashem Elokeinu diber eleinu b'chorev, rab lachem shevet b'har hazeh. It's enough being here at Har Sinai. And where are we meant to go? Panu u'se'ulachem uvo har ha'emori v'al kol shchenav. We're going to Eretz Israel. We're leaving Har Sinai, which we spent almost a year in. So if I had to put this in a particular place, I would say it is in Parashat Baalotcha, when they've almost been an entire year at Har Sinai, and now they leave the mountain to make their way to Eretz Israel. And it is at this point, V'omar elechem ba'et hahi. It's at that particular historical juncture that we say, that Moshe says, Lo uchal avadi se'et etchem, I can't cope. Hashem Elohim hirba etchem v'inechem etchem hayom k'chochvei hashamayim larov. There are so many of you, etc., etc. Hashem Elohim avotechem yosef alechem kachem elef pamim. May the Jewish people expand 1,000 times, but eicha esa levadi torchachem u'masachem v'rivchem. I can't cope with it. I can't stand it. Now, the question is, what story is Moshe relating to here? Because if you look, as you keep reading, Havu lachem anashim chachamim u'nevoim v'yiduim l'shiftechem v'asimim b'roshechem. He tells the people here, here's a solution. Take wise people, insightful people, people who are yuduim, who are known, v'asimim b'roshechem, and the people agree. He gives them the choice. And then it says he takes Roshei Shiftechem, Anashim Chachamim v'Yiduim, who become Sarei Alafim, v'Sarei Meot, Sarei Chamishim, v'Sarei Achsarot, v'Shotrim l'Shiftechem. And here we have a debate. What story are we relating to? If we take the timing of this story, as I said, it seems like we are in Parashat Baalotcha. And if we open Parashat Baalotcha, there we have the famous story where Moshe can't go on. Lama harayota lavdecha, lama lo matzati chen be'enecha lasum asa kol ha'am hazeh alai. What have I done so bad that you put this burden on me? Hanochi haritzet kol ha'am hazeh. Did I get pregnant with this people? Imanochi eladetihu. Lo uchal anochi levadi laset et kol ha'am hazeh ki chavel mimeni. I can't carry this people. And if you want me to, hargeni naharog. However, that might be the problem, and it might match the phrase where he says, Echa esa levadi, I can't carry alone this problem. But what's the solution there in Baalotcha? It is that the Shivim Zakenim, who then get prophecy, and they stand around the tent, and Eldadu Meidam Nabim B'Machaneh. This seems to be a very different solution. I will say one thing definitely is true here, which is that when it talks about who the people are, it says, Esfali shivim ish miziknei Yisrael, asher yadata ki heim ziknei ha'am v'shotrav. And Chazal come along and they say that the people they chose had actually been the shotrim in Mitzrayim. They had taken the whip for the Jewish people. These were people who were known, and that matches the phrase here in Devarim where Moshe says that you should take anashim chachamim unevorim v'yuduim. So all of that will place us in Baalotcha. But clearly, there is another candidate for where this story is from, and that is, of course, the notion of the Parsha of Yitro, Shemot, Perek Yud Chet, where we see there the appointment of Sarei Alafim, Sarei Me'ot, Sarei Chamishim, Sarei Asarot, these officers of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And these people seem to be they're given actual criteria. Here it's called Yirei Elohim, Anshe Emet, Sonei Batza, whereas in our Parsha, it's a little different. Chachamim v'yiduim, but Moshe does warn them about Betza, about greed, where he says, Lo takiru panim, kamishpat, kakaton, kagadol, right? Lo takiru panim b'mishpat. Don't play favorites, don't take bribes, whether they're old or whether they're young. Shvatem tzedek, kamishpat lelohimhu. The key word in the Parasha of Yitro is the notion of mishpat. That is the key word there, where we have v'shaftu et ha'am, we have kol at davar hakaton yishpetu heim, and v'shaftu et ha'am b'chol eit. So is this a story about mishpat and about people who are chosen on the basis of criteria? This story would seem to be, Shemot Perek Yudchet, the story of Yitro, would seem to be before Matan Torah in the first year in the wilderness. Although it is true that the Ibn Ezra says, because of this problem, that maybe this is all the same event which happens, and Yitro actually came after Har Sinai. Whichever way, the question is, what is Moshe drawing on? Is Moshe recalling the story of Yitro, or is he recalling the story of Kivrot Ta'ava? Is he recalling the story of the Sarei Alafim, Sarei Me'ot, Sarei Chamishim, Sarei Asarot? Or is it the 70 people who weren't involved in prophecy, but were involved in leadership, in the notion of, who weren't involved in justice and judgment and the courts, but were involved in prophecy and leadership? So what's the answer? And various people have suggested different things, and I've seen Rav Meidan's article, and I've seen Rav Amnon Bazak's article, but I'd like to suggest that Moshe is doing something which frequently happens, and that is he is merging two stories. In Moshe's mind at some level, or in Moshe's need to transmit this to the people, Moshe is actually trying to unite the two stories both times when kaved mimcha hadavar, the leadership of a single individual was too much. And now there was sort of a widening of the leadership group, whereby it wasn't just the big man of history, but in fact, there was a sense of delegation and there was a sense of broadening the ranks. And it's very interesting because Moshe here actually says to the people, he says, I said, Havu lachem anashim. I said, you come up with a solution. And everybody said, Vatanu yoti vatomru tov hadavar asher dibarta, that he consults with the people. So what's happening here? Why take two stories which are different, had at different times, one about prophecy, one about judgment? And I think that Moshe is saying something quite unique. Here at Sefer Devarim, in a way it's a midrash. It's a retelling of the story which keeps the essence of what's going on. Moshe's saying is, you remember there were two times when I couldn't carry on and I needed to have other people to step in alongside me and to build a hierarchy? Well, you know what? In a few weeks, I'm going to be gone. And every person is dispensable. I might be the great Moshe Rabbeinu, I might have led you for 40 years. You know, it's a big challenge. Somebody who's led for 40 years, how do you find a replacement? And maybe there's a tendency to think that Moshe is irreplaceable. And it is a very difficult thing. I remember in my childhood, having been under Margaret Thatcher for, I think it was 14 years she was in power. And then she resigned one day. And the whole country was like, she was the Iron Lady. The Prime Minister who came after had a very hard time because how do you fill those shoes? And that's the question which looms at the end of Sefer Devarim. Who's going to continue? They know that Yoshua is going to continue, but Yoshua isn't quite Moshe. Pnei Moshe, Pnei Chama, Pnei Yoshua, Pnei Levana. Yoshua is just the refracted light of Moshe. What's Moshe saying here? You can do it. There are other moments when we had to appoint, when we had to delegate, when other people took the leadership. It's okay. right? It happened once, it happened twice. I'm going to pull this into the same story. And more than that, I want to show you that when I did this, it wasn't done on a top-down basis. It was done on a bottom-up basis. It was done on a basis where I consulted with you. I asked you how you felt about it. You went ahead with it, and that's how we did it. So this is a great example of Moshe taking stories from the past and retelling them with a particular spin, with a particular aim to make a point. And if we go to the very next story, we are probably all aware of the differences between the way the story of the Tayarim or the Meraglim is told in Parashat Shalach Lecha, and then here again in Sefer Devarim. But one of the most interesting differences is this a divine command, Shalach Lecha Anashim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave a command to Moshe, send people, or is it as we read in this parsha, Vatikruvun Elai Kulchem, Vatomru Nishlecha Anashim Mefanenu. The people asked and said, we want to know where we're going. We want to Vayachbaru lanu ta'aretz, V'yashivu tanu davar, Taderech Hashaneh leba. We're going into this land, we're staging an attack. We would like a map of where we're going. It came from the people's fears, the people's attentiveness to try and plan. Likewise, Sefer, the story of the Meraglim really puts, in Sefer Bamidbar, puts the weight of the responsibility on the Meraglim themselves. That's a dahara hazot. Whereas here, who are the people, who is blamed on it? V'lo avitem la'alot, you didn't want to go up. V'tamru api Hashem, you rebelled against Hashem. V'teiragnu ba'aleichem, and you sort of mumbled in your tents, and you said, B'sinat Hashem otanu Acionim Eretz Yisrael, la'teitu otanu b'yazem ori la'ashbidenu, ana anachnu olim, etc., etc. In other words, who's guilty here? Who instigated these spies? The people. Who committed the sin of the spies? The people. What about the Meraglim? What about God? Moshe tells the story slightly differently here. Now, I'm quite sure that which is correct historically, both are correct. I'm sure that when the Meraglim was sent, certain people approached Moshe and asked him to send Meraglim, and I'm sure Hashem gave the instruction. And there's the famous Rashi at the beginning of Shalach Lecha, which tries to iron out the differences between Devarim and Bimidbar. But we've just looked at the first two stories of Sefer Devarim. And do you notice that both stories are a sense that the weight of responsibility is actually on the people. Moshe is saying, I don't need to be the great leader. You have the ability to be able to take on your own responsibility. Sarei alafim, sarei meot, sarei chamishim, sarei asarot. Sometimes eicha esalavadi, I can't do it by myself. And therefore, the ball is in your court. Likewise, in the case of the Meraglim, maybe there were leadership mistakes. Maybe there were problems done at the echelons of government. But now, says Moshe, what I want to talk to you about is your role. I'm passing the baton onto you. And that is what Sefer Devarim opens with this sense that Moshe is so aware that if the people are just waiting for leaders to come and resolve their problems, we won't get anywhere. But it is now the moment for the people to step up and realize they are going into the promised land. The success or failure of their nation building depends on them. And that there are moments in history when leadership is not there. And that's when the people of Israel have to find their resolve and have to step into the driving seats and have to take the national project forward. So that's a little bit about making Psukim timely, making Sefer Devarim. Fascinating question, is this a book of law or is it a book of tochacha? And in this regard, I think we are learning life lessons in the way that the stories are retold. Thank you for listening. Shabbat Shalom. See you next week.